Yeah, so let's get started. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Today we are presenting When Disabled Means Disenfranchised, Accessibility and American Elections. This is a presentation of the Access Committee of the Boston Society for Architecture, whose co-chairs are Josh Safdie and me, Ian Baldwin. This program has 1.5 AIA continuing education credits pending. That's in HSW. The way you get these, people who are participating and wanting to get credit, is that right now I'm gonna paste a link into the chat window. So make sure your chat window is open. Apparently the way this works is you have to be online to actually get this. So if you know people who come in later, you can forward this link to them. And also you have to sort of physically copy and paste the link into your browser. That will take you to a Google form, fill that out, and that's how you'll get your credits. Okay, good. So that bit of housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to get started, and I'll apologize. Marlene, I do not hear any vacuuming, but you guys might occasionally hear an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old running back and forth above me because I'm downstairs in the basement. So apologies in advance for that. But luckily, it's not just me. We have 4 really great experts who are really involved in this area of voting rights and accessibility. So I'd like to start off by introducing them. First off, we have Michelle Bishop. She's the Voter Access and Engagement Manager of the National Disability Rights Network, where she leads a team to provide training and technical assistance to the NDRN state network on voting rights, voter engagement, and access to the vote for people with disabilities. She also works with the civil rights community in Washington, D.C. for strong federal policy on voting rights and election administration. She has testified before Congress, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Marlene Sallow is the Executive Director of the Disability Law Center, which is Massachusetts Protection and Advocacy Agency. The agency promotes the fundamental rights of all people with disabilities to participate fully and equally in the life of the Commonwealth, including advocating for the rights of people with disabilities to vote privately and independently in all elections. She has held several positions as a civil rights attorney and was appointed by President Obama to serve as the staff director of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Gretchen Macht is an assistant professor in industrial and systems engineering at the University of Rhode Island. She holds a PhD in industrial engineering with a specialization in human factors and ergonomics. She is a computational community ergonomist who directs URI's voter operations and election systems, known as URI Votes. She has collaborated with the Rhode Island Board of Elections, the Rhode Island Secretary of State, and the Democracy Fund, and is currently working to transition her tools implemented in Rhode Island to a national scale, supported by funders that include the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. And finally, Catherine Dennis is an associate at KMA Architecture and Accessibility, a Newton-based firm that specializes in universal design and accessibility planning. Katie works primarily on municipal self-evaluations and transition plans and multifamily housing projects in both the public and private sectors. She works with developers, architects, municipal staff, and contractors to provide accessibility code consultation at the federal, state, and local levels. Prior to working at KMA, Katie worked in the nonprofit sector in positions where architecture and service work intersect. So again, very, very experienced panel, and we're very lucky to have you. Thank you all very much for being here. And I'd like to get us started. I'm going to ask Michelle, since she's the first one who I signed up to the panel, to get us started. We're sitting here 6 weeks after Election Day. Yet in a lot of ways, the election is not quite over. We still have some court challenges. We still have some runoff elections in Georgia. But maybe this is a good time to pull back a little bit and just ask, what is the state of accessible voting in this country?
Oh, that's such a big question.
Sorry, an easy one to get you started.
No, right? just a few things to talk about there. No, it's actually really amazing, the 2020 election, for a number of reasons. One, I can't believe how smoothly things went given the challenges of the pandemic. It really could have been catastrophic, like many things about 2020, and we kind of pulled it off. And we also had historic levels of turnout, right? We had one candidate who got the most votes a presidential candidate has ever gotten, and the other one got the second most votes a presidential candidate has ever gotten. That's how many people voted in 2020. That's amazing, especially everything we went through this year and everything else those voters had to deal with. This was also the year that everyone is paying attention to what happens after Election Day, which never happens. No one is ever following the count and the certification this closely. I have answered more questions about things like, what is ballot curing, than I ever have in my entire career, which is actually kind of exciting. I really like voters wanting to know what's going on and being educated, and kudos to our elections officials, because all eyes were on them like never before, and they really pulled it off, and it went so smoothly with everything that could have gone wrong. So I think there were a lot of things that were really exciting about 2020, as worried as we've been all year. Accessibility wise, overall, and in 2020 is kind of a mixed bag, I think, is really the impression I walked away with, right? Mm-hmm. I think there are some things that we think are solved issues, or that probably the average person on the street thinks we've probably fixed this by now, that we haven't, right? The majority of polling places for in-person voting are still inaccessible to people with disabilities. There are statistics from the Government Accountability Office to back this up that say, at best, in terms of architectural access, ADA compliance, about 40% of polling places are actually fully compliant. Right. We've seen challenges with the voting systems that people are using when they go to vote in person at their polling places, both in terms of how they're designed and how they're set up in the space, right? Something about the physical layout of a space that makes it usable for maybe someone who comes in a wheelchair, something like that. You can't back that machine up against a wall, or like I am. Here's my famous lime green dining room wall. It's famous now that everything's on Zoom. I used to be in my office. Now that I work out of my dining room, everyone knows this wall. If I back it all the way up against this wall and a wheelchair can't get in and turn around and face that screen, right? That's a design problem. But I think 2020 also really put a spotlight on how far behind we are in other aspects, like vote by mail systems that are traditionally completely inaccessible. I mean, traditional vote by mail is what it sounds like. We mail you a piece of paper, and not everyone can pick up a pen and read a piece of paper or mark a piece of paper independently. So we really, I think, actually ended up making a little bit of progress, especially in Massachusetts. Shout out to Disability Law Center, who did some work on that this year, in making those systems a little more accessible. So we sort of have made some progress in 2020, which was surprising. We weren't expecting that. But really, access for people with disabilities, I think, at every point in the process the voter goes through still kind of lags behind. When we talk about that in-person vote by mail, voter registration systems, so much now we rely on websites and online voter registration portals that aren't necessarily ADA compliant everywhere you go. Sample ballots that you use when you prepare to vote, a lot of them are inaccessible PDFs that are loaded on a website. So at every kind of touch point that a voter has with the process, there's still work to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do want to turn to Marlene in a second and ask her about the picture here in Massachusetts. But Gretchen, I know when we spoke, you had some interesting tales from the road that maybe talk about the sort of national picture as well. Oh, sorry. I don't know how. There you go.
All right, there we go.
Now you're here.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what Michelle was already saying. I think that what was really fascinating from 2020 is that our election officials are superheroes. And they are superheroes of democracy. And what that means, regardless if they're elected, appointed, or party, or what have you. So I think that that's something that we should be really proud of as a nation to, represent and uphold civic duty and that responsibility and relationship. Some of the things that I saw across the country, we were out there during election days in LA, in Rhode Island, and in Nebraska. So there was definitely some things that we should discuss. What does it mean to have in-person voting and the accessibility of that. What does it mean to have that with respect to ballot marking devices versus a voter verified paper audit trail? What does that mean for paper? And Michelle, yeah, not everybody can hold a pen or a pencil or a marker. So what does that mean for assistance? And yeah, when we talk about vote by mail, we know that traditionally that disenfranchises people of color. And what does it mean to now have a much larger percentage of people who are able to do that? How did that look? Not necessarily broken down by party, but broken down based on accessibility. So there's a lot of different opportunities. And I think that these types of conversations will help continue moving these things forward. Yet not everything is solved. There are a lot of glitches in the matrix, if you will. But I think that there were some things that we pulled through as a community of election geeks across the country, but also as election officials and voters. So it will be interesting to see what happens in the future, and I look forward to this discussion.
Yeah. So you mentioned Nebraska there, and I randomly had run across this other statistic. Maybe this is why you were in Nebraska, that they had the highest overall turnout rate for people with disabilities. It was about 70% there. That compares with the lowest in Kentucky, which was 42%. And this is from 2016, so not the most recent data, but I think it shows there's just this really, really huge disparity in states. So Marlene, if I can turn to you, what does it look like in Massachusetts?
So I agree with everything that everyone has identified as to issues that arose during this election. And at the same time, I'm very thankful for the fact that especially our elected officials were very nimble about taking into consideration the needs of people with disabilities that were registered voters and how to make vote by mail accessible. We worked closely with them from the beginning on language that could have been included in the law that was put in place in July. But at the end of the day, once again, individuals with print or visual disabilities, they were going to have difficulty accessing the vote by mail process because, as everyone said, they send you a ballot and you have to fill it out. So what we did was we first tried to have those conversations and do the advocacy. And then lo and behold, after the law was passed on July 6th, we went ahead and said, okay, I know the intent here is to allow voters the opportunity to vote by mail privately and independently. However, how you expect some folks to print their ballot, let alone mark it, then either hand deliver it or mail it, especially during COVID when folks are staying at home because they don't want to make themselves susceptible. So what we did was 3 weeks before the September 1st primary, we got into gear, which was really, backing up into when the law went into effect, and we just saw that the secretary's office wasn't moving forward on anything. And so we started filing lawsuits, and I won't go into detail now since we're doing the introductory piece, but ultimately we were able to make sure that everyone had accessibility to a ballot, including being able to mail in, email their ballot for the general election. So there's still a lot of work to be done, especially from the physical piece. Since I personally visited 36 polling sites across the Commonwealth and was able to identify also physical obstacles that exist.
So I definitely want to come back to you on the litigation question, because I think it's important for us as non-lawyers to understand what litigation can and can't do. But Katie, if I can turn to you, your experience is quite very much sort of boots on the ground and local. What have you seen in the different towns and cities that you work with?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working on a lot of ADA self-evaluation and transition plans for different municipalities throughout Massachusetts. And as part of that process, because voting is a program municipalities are offering, it's reviewed and heavily scrutinized. So we're not only looking at the polling locations, but we're also kind of surveying the city town clerks and making sure staff is aware of their ADA obligations. And it's been really interesting because we've gotten an array of responses about whether certain staff members are aware of obligations, and then also seeing the physical accessibility. Like you're all saying, there's definitely big issues. Massachusetts has older building stock, issues with parking, toilet rooms. A lot of times it's in a school, and the toilet rooms serving the voting are designed for children and children are not voting. So it's those kinds of things. So we're definitely seeing a lot of the physical accessibility issues you're mentioning. So I'd be happy to continue talking about that. I can geek out on it for a while, but there's definitely a lot going on with the physical accessibility.
Yeah, no, I think we should tackle that. I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff, particularly in this election. You know, there was already a lot of stuff, and then COVID came in and sort of added a whole new level of things. But yeah, maybe we should start just by tackling that area that we all sort of already know and maybe have a certain level of comfort with, which is the physical accessibility. Michelle had referenced this GAO study, which I think was from 2017, which found that about 2/3 of the polling places in the country had some sort of issue with accessibility. So yeah, I would throw that open to you guys. Have we made progress from that study 3 years ago? Is there at least an idea of a clear path forward, or is, because of the way that we handle elections in this country, which is it's devolved to states and then devolved to municipalities, what does that do to it?
I think overall in the long term, we really have made progress. Looking at those GAO studies, yes, that one was published in 17 based on the 2016 election, and they had looked at several elections prior. They looked at 2008, they looked in 2000 and surveyed polling places. And in terms of like the architectural access of a polling place, getting from parking to the voting station, that's been steadily improving. If you look back at the research they did in 2000, it was less than 20% that were compliant. Now, in terms of architectural access, we're up to 40%. And that's definitely slow progress, but it is moving in the right direction. What's interesting is that as they've continued to do these studies, they've added new components to it, like looking at the accessibility of the voting station itself. And those numbers are actually getting worse. Looking at how we set up a voting booth for people with disabilities, the types of equipment that we're voting on and how they are designed to be accessible, that is actually getting worse. And so, you know, for the first time in 2016, they combined that architectural access data with the data around the voting stations. And then you really get some scary numbers where we get back down to maybe around 20% actually being, you know, fully compliant and ready for people with disabilities. So in some ways we are doing good work very slowly. And in some ways we're actually kind of turn back the clock a little bit on accessibility. I will say though, around architectural access to polling places, it's also going to be so hard to compare that to 2020. There were a lot of polling places we couldn't use this year, right? Nursing homes sometimes serve as polling places and they can't just throw their doors open to the general public this year. So some polling places had to be relocated on the fly since we didn't know this was coming. So it might be hard to make a comparison, I think, between this year and 2016. But I think it also showed us a lot. Anecdotally, I spoke to voters who said, my polling place got moved because of the pandemic, and they moved it to a location that's definitely more accessible. I was like, the last thing I expected to hear. So then that makes me think, why did they pick that other polling place in the first place? Like, what are we doing from a practical standpoint that there was in the nearby vicinity a more accessible location? So it might also show us some places where we could maybe be doing a little better.
And yeah, to kind of build off that, I think my experience when we're working with different cities and towns is, you know, the clerks are really on top of the accessibility stuff. They do know a good amount about it and they're aware that they do have obligations they need to ensure they're meeting. But at the same time, we have had municipalities where we've said we need to look at all the physical places your city's offering programs, including voting, and they've not even included all the voting locations in that. So, you know, there is this disconnect of, yes, we're aware of all these obligations, but, you know, it seems like it's almost separate from accessibility in some ways. And they're, you know, trying to balance, you know, all the political things that go on in municipalities and deciding where voting should happen. And, you know, it's a really big question. The picture I sent Ian at the beginning of this that's on the meeting invite is actually from a town that had an abandoned school because it was closed down for asbestos reasons. And they were still working on designing and rebuilding a new school, but they still were having voting in this really old, scary building. But it had a lot of access issues because it was really old. It didn't have accessible parking. It didn't have accessible bathrooms, door maneuvering clearances, the accessible route. It checked off all the boxes in the wrong ways. So it definitely is a challenge. And like you say, changing buildings too happens not only because of a pandemic, but also because, yeah, we're closing this building down or we're redoing this. There's a lot of things. And sometimes it's a quick decision like, oh, this is a big empty room, we'll just use that. But it's not thought all the way through in terms of accessibility, that's for sure. But I think, you know, the big things I'm seeing from a physical accessibility standpoint are really parking and toilet rooms and the old building stock we're battling with here in Massachusetts. So, you know, a lot of times the voting is in the school gym, for example, but the accessible parking's at the front entrance and everyone else is using the gym entrance. So that creates a big issue. And I already mentioned toilet rooms being designed for children. Even when they are designed for adults, you know, they could be older bathrooms that were designed to an older standard, not the current, you know, they haven't been brought up to date, a lot of issues with that. And then old buildings themselves, you know, they typically have bigger thresholds, less door maneuvering clearance, designed to older standards again. So under the ADA, you do have this affirmative obligation to bring your programs up to the current standards. And, you know, I think that's getting lost sometimes. And it is a big ask sometimes because municipalities do have budgets and things they have to follow, but it's definitely a big issue. And it was interesting to hear the 40% number you provided.
You know, and I bet Gretchen would agree with this too from a national perspective. Parking lots for sure are the thing we hear about the most. Parking lots are either the lot itself is not ADA compliant and is inaccessible, especially in really challenging environments, extremely rural areas, Native American reservations, or like you said, there is accessible parking, but it's near the entrance is not the voter entrance. Or my favorite, there's accessible parking and all the poll workers are parked in it. This happens sometimes. And some of them have parking tags, right? Because if you look at the average age of the poll workers, some of them do have a parking tag, but we've got to figure out where else we can maybe have those folks park so voters can get there. So yeah, parking lots we find overall is one of the most challenging things, but it's really important for voters to be able to access their polling places. It's also amazing what you can do with like some traffic cones and some duct tape to make a parking lot temporarily accessible. And we'd love to see more of that. We know to an extent our elections officials, sometimes their choices are as good as their options, and they tell us a lot that there aren't better, more accessible locations within this precinct. We're kind of working with what we've got. But then you got to figure out how to work it, right? And that's when I need to see you putting down some temporary ramps and using some orange traffic cones to make accessible parking spaces with like a space for a lift or a ramp to come down, you know, taping or propping open some heavy doors, taping down cords, all those little things you can do to make those polling places accessible, even if it's just for election day.
Yeah, I would like to echo a little bit from that. Is there's almost a three-prong kind of idea here. First is funding. there was a serious lack of federal funding for this particular election, and there was a lot of private money that made this possible to be so successful, both in person and vote by mail. And when we talk about in person and accessibility, and you talk to certain election officials, if they have to make a decision on how to spend that money, it's going to be a one-time shot. It's not going to be a constant, continuous improvement because they don't know when the next volume of money is going to happen. So if they've got a shot to fix a ramp and this is the money that they have to do it, then they can actually fix the ramp. And that's where when we talk about money in voting, it's not just all machines, it's not all ballots, it is actually physical in-person accessibility. But it's also been a challenge in the second prong was when we talk about COVID and in-person voting, most people were concerned about what it meant to be in the actual space. So what it meant to be marking your ballot or checking in, is there hand sanitizer? Are people wearing masks? Do they feel safe? What does that mean in the space? We were talking to AIA members, we were talking to ASHRAE members, we were talking to all sorts of people. How do we direct, the booth? Do we direct them at each other? No, we do not. So it's those types of conversations nationally were happening a lot more in terms of the inside of the voter setup. And then the other thing that we have to discuss is what it means to select a location in the first place. And when we talk about that, there is a rigorous process on how to select a voting location. But you are exactly correct. We didn't have senior centers. We also didn't have a lot of schools or even religious centers where we normally do. If we look at some of the preliminary results, most people voted in community centers, and community centers are naturally designed to be more accessible, as long as they were, updated in the last few decades, than some of those other locations. So there is definitely a different trend on community centers and other government buildings. So there were some issues with the government buildings in terms of intimidation and where they were in proximity to police locations and, video monitoring and some other issues. But when we talk about how those decisions are made, when we were talking about COVID, and a lot of these places said, no, we will not open, we will not. And even in Rhode Island, when we had at the deadline of the end of September of here are all of our locations, a few days later, the Board of Elections made a decision, no, you must open all of them. And in a span of 2 weeks, they had to go and check a whole new list. They had 300 and some, then they had to go up to 50, 60 more locations in the matter of a couple weeks. And when it comes down to it, how do you make those decisions in such a short period of time? We gave mad props already to election officials for being flexible and dynamic, but also how do you design a system if your primary concern is just to open it? And then once you open it, how do you set it up inside? And then they think about the outside. But if we have precincts like we do in Rhode Island, and we only expect maybe 1,000 to 3,000 people showing up in that location, there are some areas in Rhode Island, based on our population density, there's only one spot where those people can vote. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be ADA compliant in every way, shape, or form. And so it's a challenge. I think that there's a lot of different things that we need to consider.
And Marlene, how does it work in Massachusetts? Is it I think it's really interesting to hear Gretchen talk about Rhode Island and that process by which the state oversees the municipalities who are actually carrying out these elections. What sort of, and we know we have federal legislation and we have these municipalities that set up the precincts where you actually go to vote. What's the state's role mediating in between that?
The Secretary's office is actually charged with providing training to all of the municipalities on accessibility and accommodations, the ADA accommodations. They also will at times reach out to the Disability Law Center if a municipality is considering a new voting site. And they have in the past asked us to actually go out and conduct a site survey of the site to make sure that it's accessible inside and out. But what we saw happen this year was obviously that because of COVID, the early voting, the 2-week window for early voting, they had to consolidate the sites. And so in in one municipality, for instance, and it's not a very small town, I may add, they consolidated into one location, which made it extremely difficult for individuals that have mobility problems to get to, because that coincided with the decrease in public transportation to that area. And so as a result, we were getting phone calls from voters saying, normally I vote here, now it's consolidated to there, but there's no bus taking me there, or the ride, which is used by some individuals with mobility problems, couldn't get them there in a timely fashion. So that was like the added layer. And then when I conducted the polling site surveys, I traveled to the islands and all along the southern part of Mass, like from Worcester west, and then up to from the Berkshires all the way to the very top to the university up there. And there were some communities that were very small. They were consolidated into one building or structure in some cases, where there was no accessibility. In one particular structure, because it was literally that, there were 2 spots, regular spots, and then the handicap parking spot was on an incline up against the soil. And they had, so what I did was I actually would research the night before which polling sites were in the route that I was taking to find out what their working hours were. And in some instances, they weren't even open during their scheduled working time. And although they were supposed to be open for 14 days straight, some of the smaller municipalities decided, hey, we're only going to do this on Tuesdays and Thursdays from like 9 to 11 in the morning. And that's when they would show up. And this one municipality, I'm out there and I'm like measuring the parking spots, which were 2.5, basically. And I'm jotting it down. And all of a sudden, an officer pulls up behind me. And I was like, that's it. You know, somebody saw me through the trees and called. But he was actually going to the structure, which also served as the DV shelter. And it was just like a multi-pronged approach to all their needs in the community. And so I said, hey, the hours were X to X. And he's like, well, I was here early in the morning. They weren't here. And they're obviously not here today. So I don't think they showed up at all today.
And that site you mentioned, I think that was the one you had mentioned that was in Nantucket, right? Initially that they moved it and it was like 3/4 miles away from the bus stop.
Yeah, but that wasn't for this voting cycle, but it actually was for the midterm election in 2018. Mm-hmm. They were going to move it from the school, which was a pretty new school, fully accessible, to another location. And I had to figure out a way to get there using Uber. And then the Uber dropped me off in front of the site, and it was an old VFW building. Right. And it was just not accessible physically in some instances. And if anyone needed to get to that particular site, they took the bus would leave them about half a mile down the road. Yeah. Because this structure was near the airport. Right. So there's that issue. But in this particular voting cycle, the town that combined everything is actually not rural. It's south of Boston, and a lot of folks live there. But unfortunately, because of the cutbacks in public transportation, the site that they chose was not accessible either because of lack of public transportation.
Right. And that's something I think we forget about often because, I mean, there is a focus on parking and accessibility of parking. But as you point out, especially if you live in Boston and maybe you don't drive anyway, if the polling site isn't accessible on public transit, then you're kind of out of luck. And I think you were saying that there's been some real challenges presented by the Mbta service cuts.
There are a lot of challenges, yes, and they continue to happen, and now they're going to cut back even more. And so we're now in a place where DLC is actually working with a staff up at the State House to try to figure out how can we make some of these changes permanent, because as was said earlier, you know, processes were put in place to cover this election, but now those processes may go by the wayside. Especially, you know, submitting your ballot either by email or just voting by mail overall. And part of that has to do with funding. So for instance, I just found out that in Massachusetts, the program that we had to allow folks to vote online, you know, as soon as the election was over, they're not paying for that program anymore. And so where does that leave us for the next round? Yeah,
Wow.
Michelle, I just found that out. So where do we go from here? And then I think the biggest, I guess the biggest thing that rubbed me the wrong way is in some municipalities that are small, they're like, well, you know, we only have 200 and something registered voters. We know our folks, they don't need this, that, or the other. Well, that's not the point. The point is that, you know, the law requires you to do A, B, and C. And so maybe the clerks are aware of what they need to do, but does that ultimately trickle down to the volunteers? And are the volunteers actually absorbing the requirements and then making sure that those requirements are being implemented? So I think that's another area where a lot of work still needs to take place.
I would like to comment on that. I completely agree. When we had an experience in one of the locations in this November, the Uber dropped us off at a certain location, and then who sets up the signage? Well, it's the volunteers. It's the poll workers. And they set up the signage that you had to go through a courtyard and then down these massive concrete stairs. Not, hey, you could go around here or you can go here, because if you go around this way, that was ADA accessible, but it took forever to get there. And there was an individual who fell down the stairs and we had to call 911. They broke their arm. It was really disturbing to look at, but they refused to get in to the ambulance until they voted. And it was one of those moments where they were surrounded by 5 EMTs and they said, just give me a piece of paper. I don't care how I need to vote. I just want to vote right now. I'm voting for the president. Just give me, like, I'm voting for, I'm doing this. And when they finally voted and got through the process, you know, everybody cheered in the whole location. But it was like, why was that necessary? Why was that a means or an opportunity for having that kind of level of stress? So I think that it's also, yes, how do we train them to set up the exterior as well as they are being trained to set up the interior experience as well?
And I have to add this, and it's not structure per se, but in one polling site, we asked about the AutoMark machine because we've used the AutoMark machine all the time in Massachusetts.
Marlene,
yes.
Can you just quickly explain for those of us who don't know what exactly is the AutoMark machine?
So the AutoMark machine will actually allow someone to feed the ballot into the machine. It reads the ballot to them. So if they're blind, they can vote. Anyone can use the AutoMark machine, and we stress everyone that we meet to please use it to make sure the volunteers are trained in how to set it up. But it allows you to vote if you specifically have a visual or even physical disability, because you can also use the puffer to mark the ballot electronically with the machine. But in this particular municipality, which was small and in a very rural area, the AutoMark machine was not working. And so my staff person said, well, what does someone do if the only way that they can vote is by using the AutoMark machine? And the response from the volunteer was, well, they don't vote. And that was just it, right? And so there is such a lack of I think, trickle down education and training, you know, not from the state to the municipality leaders to then the volunteers. In another municipality, I asked about the AutoMark machine and the lady was like, I'm new here. I don't know what you're talking about. I expressed to her the need to have it set up. I gave her my business card and she, to her credit, she called me 36 hours later, apologized, said, oh, that's what we call the handicap machine. And the machine was in the basement. So we've now brought it up and set it up. So there you go.
Wow.
Yeah, I can say, I mean, this is definitely these types of issues that we see specifically on election day, absolutely are national in scope. Poll workers don't get anywhere near enough training. There is no federal requirement that they receive any training. So some poll workers aren't trained at all. And we see these kinds of things everywhere. First of all, shout out to the person who voted with a broken limb.
Yeah.
do that, but you are the real hero of 2020. And I've worked with Election Protection Coalition on election day, where we take calls from voters, and I've spoken to women who are in labor who are going to vote before they go to the hospital. It's incredible. I love voters, but we get calls like these kinds of things all the time. I got calls from a polling place in Florida in 2016. Voters in line were freaking out because the poll workers were lifting a man in his wheelchair and carrying him up a grassy hillside. That polling place was accessible. It had an alternate entrance the poll workers didn't know existed. So they thought they were doing the right thing. It's also incredibly dangerous and just begging for a lawsuit, right? But they thought they were really helping this voter because no one had told them that there was an alternate entrance that they needed to make sure was unlocked and have some signage leading to it. So we hear about these kinds of things all the time. And they're really, not only are they detrimental to voters with disabilities, but there's sometimes things that are dangerous for people with disabilities. And it can happen there in, I believe it was Tennessee a few years ago, there was a lawsuit because someone tripped over a power cord that hadn't been secured. All you gotta do is take that thing down and then you are an election official who's not getting sued. But we hear about these kinds of things all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. And to echo that, yeah, we're seeing the same thing. So we'll get survey responses from the voting programs in cities and towns where, you know, the clerk will say, yeah, we're aware we have to provide accommodations and we have to provide information on accessibility. But then the next question will be, do you have a statement of non-discrimination, and do you have somewhere you're showing where the accessible routes are, where information can be found on them? And the answer will be no. So it's like that disconnect. There's something going on. But it's interesting to me to hear all these too, because when I think about it, accessibility, creating an accessible polling location, for example, you know, having everyone use the accessible route is better for everyone. You know, it creates a safer voting environment. It creates equality for everyone. And, you know, you don't need to be someone with a disability to benefit from a hill with less slope and not a giant staircase. You know, there's many different reasons to push for accessibility, not just because of people with disabilities. And then the last thing I just wanted to add too is, from a funding standpoint, the voting piece, yes, has very strict budgets and things, but it's interesting because a lot of this, because these are in municipal buildings and they are used for other things, there's other places they can look for funding. So like the schools could look for funding, you know, and they can use the voting as kind of a way to help. I mean, I know it's tough. There's definitely a bunch of political things going on, but it's kind of a double whammy. You're fixing a municipal building, and by chance, you're also fixing your voting. So there's a lot of layers here, and it's very difficult to unravel. But I think what I told Ian early on when we were having conversations about doing this is, it's not necessarily that everyone knows everything about accessible voting, but it's knowing when to ask the question. So if you're designing a school, ask, is there going to be voting here? And then think about that all the way through. If you're, you know, a poll worker, you know, maybe the city should develop a policy, like to even just a sheet of paper that says what their expectations are for accessible voting, or who to reach out to if there's accessible questions, you know. But it's these things like knowing the slope of an accessible parking space isn't so important as knowing, this parking space is weird, it's like this. Who should we ask about it? You know? So
yeah. And maybe, and is it also, just to follow up on that, Katie, is it also, because I remember when we were talking before, we were talking about, and with Gretchen as well, we were talking about site selection. Mm-hmm. So is it also, what role do you have in helping these towns just to start, say, okay, you've got, you know, these buildings, this will work better, and there will have to be fewer changes to it, this one won't work as well. To what degree do you find that the towns listen to you and maybe are able to start to come up with processes that maybe help them avoid some problems in the first place?
Sure. So we are working on a lot of municipal ADA self-evaluation and transition plans, which every city and town is supposed to have by now, but they don't. Majority don't. But doing this process, you're evaluating kind of their current facility stock. So you're looking at all their buildings and parks and all that, and telling them this is a okay-ish location and here are all the barriers versus, so you're giving them kind of that information that they could then use to decide maybe where things should go. But again, it gets difficult because we know cities and towns aren't doing this. There's not a lot of, there's some litigation around providing self-evaluation and transition plans, but it's not huge, so people don't feel as obligated. A lot of the municipalities we're working with choose to do a self-evaluation transition plan because there's funding tied to it. If you do this, then you can apply for other types of funding, which is, you know, good. But it's tricky because it's kind of its own separate multi-layer thing, like voting. There's so many different avenues for it, different eyes. But you know, if towns are doing this, they will have a list of, here's all your buildings, here's what's wrong with them all, and they can use that to determine kind of what makes the most sense.
If I could jump in quickly, I think two incredibly important points have come up recently. The first is that you don't have to know everything if you know who to ask. Like if you're in Boston, Marlene should be your best friend and you should be talking to the Disability Law Center, because whatever you don't know about access for people with disabilities, they definitely do and can get you people with disabilities to come test it out for you and everything. Why anyone doesn't leverage that, I will never understand, right? Just have the right friends, the right partners, and you can do it right from the start. But I think also the second thing to me is stepping back and thinking about the way that we design and build things in the first place. Why are there stairs and a ramp? There's this great cartoon where there's students waiting to get into a school and it's winter. And there's a custodian shoveling off the stairs. And there's one student in a wheelchair who's like, can you shovel the ramp? I can't get in. And he's like, all these students are waiting for the stairs. I'll do the ramp next. And the student is like, if you just shovel the ramp instead of the stairs, we can all go inside, right? Why? Why do we create the main way and then the accessible way, when the accessible way works for everyone and could be the main way? People with disabilities are used to this, right? People with disabilities, you know, pre-pandemic, try to go out to a restaurant and it's like, oh, it's accessible. You just have to go around the block through a really sketchy alleyway, past a dumpster, and then come in through the kitchen. And then we'll get you in through the back and then you can come out to the dining room. Why?
That happened to my grandmother. It didn't go well for them.
Right? When we're trying to like go out for somebody's birthday and it's like half of us are going to go around, we'll be back in like 10 minutes. We got to go like knock on a sketchy back door and hope that like somebody who's washing dishes lets us in. Like, why do we even make things that way in the first place when you can start from the beginning by making something that's fully inclusive with that baked in? And then it's going to work for everyone and we avoid some of these problems.
And I have to jump in on that because that's like my pet peeve. And so for me, I think it is the duty of the Secretary of State to bring to take a multidisciplinary approach to the planning process, right? Like I'm not an urban planner, but I'm a big picture person. And so when you're talking about early voting, why didn't someone have somebody from the Mbta at the table to say, we're now going to have to combine all these polling sites in each of these municipalities? What does public transportation look like there? What do the curb cuts look like? Because, you know, we're Boston. We're actually suing people right now because of lack of curb cuts. So like, why aren't we thinking this through and looking at the big picture and how all the different points feed into one another to make it a fully accessible system? Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox.
Marlene, if I can just extend that a little bit. Okay, so I mean, it's great to hear a lawyer talking about the big picture and talking about fixing problems outside of the courtroom. But one thing I said I wanted to get to is what is the role of bringing legal actions? Like what can we expect that to do in terms of stimulating change, and what can it do?
So for us, the lawsuits that we brought, first it was in state court and then it was in federal court. And we prevailed. We got agreements in both courts. It was about making folks fully aware of the fact that although they think what they're doing is appropriate and it's accommodating everyone, they're forgetting about it. And so although the legislature passed, accessible electronic vote by mail, there were still pieces in there that were missing. One of them was, did anybody think about how to get the word out to the public as to how they could register for accessible vote by mail? And then what does that look like? Oh, well, we're just going to send them a PDF, by email. They can call us, they can register. We'll send them a PDF by email. They're supposed to print it out, fill it out by hand, put it in an envelope, and then put it in the mailbox or bring it to the local clerk's office. Not everybody can do that. And so how are we going to work this out? So they come up with this PDF, and we go on the website because the PDF is now live. And guess what? PDF isn't accessible. So then we tell them that, and they're like, well, our IT person looked at it. So then it was a back and forth. We ultimately, used the JAWS and another type of reader to make sure that it was accessible by different products out there, and they were able to fix it. So because of us filing the lawsuit, they were required, as a result of the mediated agreement, to get an what they call an accessible vote by mail coordinator, right? To receive the calls of people that want to vote by mail. That wasn't even set up right. It was so difficult. So at the end, you really only had 14 people that were able to avail themselves of this process for the September 1st election. So as soon as that was over, we're like, okay, now we got to take it to the next step, because we had already said some folks were not able to avail themselves of it because they have print disabilities, they have visual disabilities, they can't print it out and fill it in. So we were like, well, you allow all military members that live in Mass to vote using email. Why can't you make that happen? And, the word that we got back is that's not what that system was set for. We can't make that decision, meaning the secretary's office. So we're like, fine, we're suing. So we sued in federal court to permit email submission of the electronic ballots with an accessible electronic affidavit, right? So they're working through this, and they're like, but the person still has to sign. I'm like, how can they sign? Some people aren't able to sign. So then through the lawsuit, we were also able to allow some voters typed signature, which would be completed on the screen, read or accessible application to submit it that way. So from a lawsuit perspective is sometimes they don't realize that what they think is accessible and the ideas that they have in play really covers the needs of every single registered voter. And as we stress all the time, like, they have a right to vote independently and privately, whether there's a pandemic or not. And so just because in the past people have received the paper ballots and they've used it to vote, well, guess what? Sometimes they have to have maybe a personal care assistant help them fill it out. That's not private. That's not independent. And so they're just trying to go along with you so that they don't lose their right to vote. But that's not right. Like, everyone deserves to be treated equally. And setting up these, obstacles for people with disabilities to vote where everyone else can do it independently and privately it just doesn't make any sense. So our federal court said, fine, you guys are going to be able to, with the adjustments that we asked for, voters who are blind or with low vision or mobility and dexterity disabilities or even print disabilities were able to use the AVBM electronic ballot system without third-party assistance. So that was great. So they could print, they could, type in their name, and then they could send it as an attachment via email for those that avail themselves of that. Now, the issue we're having is we want to figure out how many people actually avail themselves of that. And so we haven't been able to get that data yet. So we continue to try to get that. But, like I said, this week alone, I discovered that the program that they were paying for that allowed for this system to be put in place, Voting Works, that's not, their license to use it has now expired. Oh, no. So we've got to come up with a plan on how to make sure that this continues moving forward, because why is it that it was acceptable for this to happen, because of a pandemic, but it's not acceptable any other time when we vote?
Yeah, I mean, so it seems like this is sort of the new frontier, right? So in addition to what you just mentioned, the sort of jury-rigged absentee system, we've all become familiar with a bunch of new phrases this election cycle, early voting, curbside, in-person absentee, which I still can't quite get my head around. But I'd love to throw it open to you guys and say, how are these methods, to what degree are these methods helping? And even after the pandemic, I mean, let's knock on wood, let's say that maybe in 2 years, COVID is not really much of a factor for the midterm elections. How are these other methods going to be around, and how are they going to impact traditional precinct voting?
So I'm just going to say, like, from a legal perspective, we tried to get the curbside voting because we actually have that in Northern Virginia, which is where I lived for a while. And so I thought that was a great accommodation to have in play, but the regulations in Massachusetts do not allow curbside voting. So that's another area where lawyers can play a role, is if you really want to make the change, then try to advocate for changes in regulations. And if you can push them to try to change it during open comment session, get folks to provide input.
I have so many thoughts on all of these things. So many thoughts. I mean, first, right? Like, okay, let's get into it. I see like everybody's ready. Let's go. I think when we were talking about making that vote by mail accessible, 2020 was the year where I heard more accusations of fraud in the vote by mail system than I ever have in my life. There's not a lot of evidence to support any of those claims, but that idea is out there now, right? And when someone can directly receive their ballot and mark it privately and independently, which is their federal right, that's how we stop fraud in the vote by mail system. When somebody else has to receive it and give it to you, especially like if you live in a long-term care facility and it's coming by postal mail and that has to go through somebody else to get to you, or when you have to rely on somebody else to mark it, that's where people's concerns seem to be. So why don't we build a system where they can receive it directly and mark it privately and independently and not have to rely on others who some folks are really worried are going to mark it wrong. So I think it just makes sense on so many levels. Curbside voting, I used to have a very love-hate relationship with curbside voting. I think it's really valuable for voters who use it, but I've always been concerned that elections officials were using it instead of making their polling places fully accessible. And that always bothers me. I mean, DOJ will tell you can't do that. It's not a fair loophole, but it happens. After 2020, I'm like all in on curbside voting. And the number one reason would be as someone who takes calls from voters on election day, people who tested positive for COVID-19 after the deadline to apply for an absentee ballot had to go and vote in person, period. So you can either let them vote curbside, or you can ask them to stand in line and walk inside and potentially infect hundreds of people with the virus, or thousands if they give it to a poll worker who's there all day, right? So it just makes sense. It made sense for people who are immunocompromised, who needed to be able to vote. A lot of them, their vote by mail ballots didn't come in time. So now either I got to go to the polling place or not vote. If I can stay in my vehicle and interact with one or two poll workers, that's a lot safer. But I also think it makes sense as a type of reasonable accommodation. Even if we have a fabulously accessible polling place, what about someone for whom just getting in and out of the car is difficult? Standing for any length of time, walking any distance is difficult. It's a great accommodation for them. The last thing too, that this raised for me was Dropbox voting. I'm a huge fan. I voted by Dropbox. My polling place during early voting had a line that was anywhere from 2 to 6 hours long every day of early voting. I was in and out in 10 minutes because I put it in the Dropbox and rolled out. So I love it, but it's really interesting. A lot of times when we talk about physical access, we think, especially when we talk about a place like Boston, some of these are really old buildings that have been retrofitted to be accessible because they were built pre-ADA. So that's why there's stairs and we kind of put a ramp on afterward, right? But we do this even with brand new things, brand new buildings and drop boxes that were new in many, many places created this year and did not meet ADA regulations for heights and reach lengths and those types of things, or regulations for getting physically up to the drop box. So we got calls about drop boxes that were in the middle of a grassy field. I don't know why anyone would put it there in the first place, but there's no accessible path of travel to get up to that drop box. So sometimes we're working with what we've got, but sometimes when we have a brand new opportunity, we're still missing the mark.
Yeah, I would like to talk about that in terms of what we call equal and what we call equity. And it's equal if I give all of you a box, but if you're all different heights, you still can't see over the fence. But if one of you can already see over the fence, you don't need a box. Give it to somebody who's shorter. And that's what it means. We've all seen that meme on the internet of what it really means to be equal versus equitable. We see it in how people do even resource allocation of what you get inside a voting location. Well, I gave everybody the same stuff, so isn't that okay? So it's talking about those types of things. I think that when we also talk about waiting in line, since I am an engineer who cares about queuing and all that fancy stuff, I want to bring that up. When we look at some of the preliminary reports, even most recently this week by MIT, where they do their national survey, we're seeing that people in early voting, exactly correct what Michelle was talking about, they are waiting in lines at the same kind of lines that people were waiting in 2008. It was not necessarily the same on election day or all in person, but really extreme waiting in line. And I've seen it myself where I've seen poll workers who feel that they are identified as an ADA person, who have said, you know what, I feel bad for everybody who's waiting in line, who's like me, and have actually created a separate line for who they see as ADA persons, create a totally separate line. And then somebody's like, well, you created an ADA line. Yeah, but you can't be in here. Well, why not? Well, I don't see that you're old or disabled, so therefore you can't be in this line. They're like, I am a police officer who got shot on duty. I classify, by blah, 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 blah. I mean, we know based on accessibility that not all issues are visible, but that person, it took them 10 minutes to set up an ADA line, but it took the supervisor of that polling location an hour and a half to break it down. So it comes, some of these things are just, when we think about it from a systems perspective, it comes full circle. When we have to attack this in a multi-pronged approach in terms of what does it mean to wait in line? What does it mean for design? If you're designing a new hotel out there, architects, how are you designing that hotel? Can I put a voting system in the lobby of that hotel? Because that would be great. Those types of things, a multi-purpose use housing, what does that look like? And I think that there's a lot of different opportunities that if we start considering not just making it equal, but making it equitable, and then not just fixing a crack in a bad wall in terms of like the voting system and ADA and what we've inherited, but we start breaking it down and be like, you know what, we need to redo that wall. We need to stop thinking about it exactly. Ramp versus stairs. Why not just all ramps? I don't get it. So it's just that type of conversation, but it's also not just retraining and poll workers and the election officials, but everybody who designs the built environment. What does that mean? So I think that's everything I had on my little index card.
And I'll just add, so I live in a town where I voted by a box, and it's in the middle of a field that you have to go step up a curb to get to in the grass, and it's brand new. And I was outraged. But as an accessibility consultant, we're all echoing this, like, it really does get back to kind of who's responsible. Is it the person designing this box? Should they put something in the spec that says you have to put it at XYZ location? Is it the building inspector who should be checking for accessibility, even though they have 10,000 other things on their plate? Is it, the lawyers? Is it it seems like everyone's got a little bit of their fingers in the pot, but it's very hard to determine responsibility. And the other thing I wanted to add was similar to, why aren't we doing ramps everywhere? I think these alternative means of voting are helpful for many people, not just people with disabilities. I have a small toddler at home who doesn't sleep very well, and it was very nice to be able to just drive up, drop my vote off, and go, not have to wait in a line, not have to, you know, find time after I'm working. And, you know, it's those things that I think it does benefit many different people. But yeah, it's a tricky thing. And, you know, we know designers aren't designing to accessibility standards. Buildings aren't being built to accessibility standards. Massachusetts has some very confusing accessibility standards, you know, and the building inspectors, again, they have 10,000 other things on their plate. So sometimes it goes by the wayside and it's not really an issue until someone points it out. And I think that systemically is not the way it should be. You know, it should be something flagged in the design phase and fixed before it even gets built. But then it's who's responsible for that, and it's very tricky.
I like to say that we're all responsible to make sure that, you know, accessibility, accommodations, and equality and equity are present along all the time. Like I tell anyone who will listen, like this, when you go out and vote, like take a look around, make sure that if there's someone in line that looks like, you know, they may need a seat, go flag someone inside and so that they can get assistance. You know, if someone needs direction, provide them with direction. If you see that it makes no sense, and this was one of the sites that I went to, where you had to go all the way to the back of a parking lot that had potholes in it to go through the quote unquote handicap accessible door, which had this long winding ramp, and then the door opened towards you. So you had to, if you were in a wheelchair, you kind of had to like wheel your way back up against the railing to allow the door to ultimately clear to then get in. And then you have to go through this long hallway to get to an elevator to get up to the second floor. Like, how is that equitable, right? Like this person is walking a longer distance and going through and encountering more barriers than are necessary. I think we also need to remember the intersectionality between race, ethnicity, English as a second language, disability, as we're setting up any accommodations that are being set up, and as we're looking at the location of the polling site. So there was one town that I went to where not only was, this is where we conduct our, you know, commission town hall meetings. Well, they had, and it's accessible to everybody. Well, perhaps because you have an elevator, but they actually had like these like carpets, I guess, or thrown, and they were, it was not a smooth path for anyone that was using a walker or cane or a wheelchair. And they actually had an armed officer sitting feet from where people are casting their ballot. On top of that, you can tell that, you know, I am not, you know, that I'm probably Latina or some other race and ethnicity from looking at me. And the reason why I say this is because they called me that girl. And why is that girl here? And does that girl have the right to be here? And you know how you get the feeling like maybe I not wanted, so it's time for me to go. So I made note of what transpired, but I did leave. Well, one of my staff people and I got our wires crossed, and she ended up going to the same site the following day. And they said, yeah, we had some girl that came here yesterday with a pink wallet. And, oh, do you want to look at the site? Here's the fob. Have at it. Feel free to go through the entire building and check out all the accessibilities and the accommodations that we provide. So there was also that stark difference in how they approached me versus how they approached, you know, my colleague in the office, and the way that they felt empowered to call me that girl was really disheartening. But more disheartening was the fact that no one found it offensive in any way, shape, or form to have an armed officer literally 3 yards from where people were casting their ballots inside the ballot room, not even sitting outside. Yeah. And in another location, I actually had an officer follow me through the entire building to the point where he was in my space, and I stopped short so he would have to bump into me. So we also need to think about that when we're out.
So, and I'm sure people in our audience probably have a lot of experiences too, both as voters and maybe as professionals. So we have a little bit more than 15 minutes left. So I'd like to sort of throw it open to Q&A. So if anyone in the audience wants to ask a question, just say in the chat, I have a question, and I'll unmute you, and we'd love to hear your experience. I know in some of our previous programs, we've had some really great feedback from people in the audience with their own experiences. So if you're able to do that, that's now open. This also reminded me, Marlene, when you were talking and you mentioned about sort of offering assistance to people. Gretchen had an interesting anecdote about that, about how this played out in a polling place, and how a sort of AirSAT's act of empathy could have maybe potentially been a problem. Oh, here, I'll unmute you, Gretchen.
Yeah, so that's where I mentioned that they created their own line, and it was really fascinating from an observer perspective, because I wasn't, it's better if I don't say anything. I'm just supposed to be there and watch things happen around me, which can be very stressful at times. And this was clearly very stressful. And when you had people judging other people, but even from an empathetic perspective, it was still really troubling. And then you see the suit show up, and the suit starts asking questions, and then you're like, okay. And it was really, it came from an empathetic place. It came from a place of understanding. But what does it mean, right? When you start, is it real understanding? So it's a problem. I think that we need to bring back some of that conversation about poll worker training, but we also have to recognize that these people maybe only do it this is the only time that they do it. We know that recruitment was really challenging in November as well. But what we did see, because we know that historically our retired persons or our older community are the people who work in in-person voting locations, and we know that they were the most at risk during COVID. So what we did see was some really phenomenal outreach that happened nationally, where you had seniors in high schools volunteering, and they were the persons in those locations cleaning cleaning the tables, cleaning the technology. They were the ones putting themselves in harm's way while still being, completely compliant with COVID risk mitigating strategies, but still picking it up for the older members of the community. And even in Rhode Island, if you are 16 years old and you are registered to vote, you can volunteer in a polling location. So I think that it also started to reinvigorate younger generations of participation as well. So I think that in that arc, there's again, the 2020. There are some positives and there are some real negatives. And I think that it'll be really fascinating to see where we continue as a community. Marlene, I completely agree. We are all responsible. So how do we enact that responsibility? How do we feel that our voices are accessible? How does that mean to feel heard, to be seen? And I have to say, I'm really sorry that happened to you. It's one of those things that, we have to, as a community, really stand up and start to be responsible for who we are and what we see.
Yeah. So I've got a couple questions from Emmanuel, actually our former co-chair, Emmanuel Andrade, and then Jay Garofalo. So I'm going to unmute them. And Emmanuel, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yes, thank you. So I am a planner in state government, and I'm a former access consultant. My very last project as an access consultant before my jump into state government work was an access audit of polling places for a major municipality in Massachusetts. And it was very eye-opening to see the horrors of polling places that are completely inaccessible. And most of the inaccessible places for that major town and city in Massachusetts were places that did not belong to the municipality, but places that were leased or somehow had an arrangement with the city to become a polling place once a year. Old churches with gravel parking lots and no accessible entrance or bathrooms. Private clubs like Elks or VFW posts and things like that. So we uncovered lots of physical infrastructure that was not ready to accept voters with disabilities and were discriminating. And then once we brought it up to the city, the first reaction was, well, those are private spaces. Yes, but you and the private landlord and the city as a government entity have shared responsibility on this matter. And for me, you know, some of the experiences and stories you all mentioned during this meeting about lack of communication, I've seen that during that voting day. The inspection happened during election day, of course. And just a lack of communication will involve all three levels of government, right? Federal elections and then overseen by the state, but then run by the local government. And then to add to the communication issues, and then you involve a private owner as the host of a polling place. So anyway, I've seen that as an access consultant, and I really empathize with all the experiences that we've been sharing today. So thank you for all of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's really important, I think, because the vast majority of spaces are required to comply with the ADA all the time, right? A lot of people say, "Oh, we're grandfathered in." That's not a thing. But there are, churches are different, private clubs are different. The ADA is different on Native American reservations. There are polling places that are in people's little house, their private homes. That's different. There are some spaces we use as polling places that are different under the ADA. But what you're saying is exactly true. When it's serving as a polling place, it has to comply. Whether or not it does any other day of the year, it does when it's a polling place. And I hate that sometimes we just hear, well, we don't own it. It's a private space. We can't come in and like pour cement to make a ramp or whatever. Well, first of all, you could with your permission. I mean, you could. Or you could do whatever you can do as a temporary thing. You absolutely have the right to do that on election day. Any of those like low cost modifications that you can do same day. Or we've seen amazing things happen when elections officials really take responsibility for this and work on it. There's, we've talked a lot with, I'm going to say it's Jefferson County, Alabama, challenging environment to make accessible. They have a lot of rural area. They have this amazing story where there was a church that was being used as a polling place, historic Black church in that community. It was very important to people. They did not want that polling place to be moved, but it was not accessible. It needed a ramp. They got a local, like, big box construction store to donate lumber, and they found a Carpenters for Christ group to donate their labor, and they built a ramp on that church for free. So now it's an accessible polling place, and it's accessible 365 days a year for anyone who wants to worship there also. So like, if you really try to problem solve these issues, it's doable. They got a national big box chain to donate that lumber. Like, I can't get them to give me anything for free. So it's possible when elections officials really take responsibility for it.
Yeah. We also had another question from Jay Garofalo. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say that I empathize with Marlene on that perception and how everybody perceives you when you walk in. It's huge. I'm non-binary, so when I go into a bathroom, I have to choose. Have people been calling me sir today? Let me use the male. Have people been calling me ma'am today? Let me use the female. I've actually been called sir, ma'am. So I don't know what bathroom to use when that happens, but I can imagine it being a huge issue for persons with disabilities who are also non-binary or trans. Like, just, you already have that perception of you're not allowed in this bathroom because of how I perceive you, but I'm also judging you on using this bathroom because I don't think I see your disability as well. So that perception, and it's also, I have a sister-in-law with POTS, which is an autoimmune disorder, and her body doesn't regulate, her heart doesn't pump what it needs to throughout her body. So when she goes from a sitting to standing position, she can collapse. And she's gotten very, like, terrible looks when she uses her wheelchair and then gets up and is able to walk to somewhere. And it's that disconnect and that perception that is horrible to navigate when you go out in public like that. But that was mostly a comment, but my question is, do you find that, I'm actually one of Katie's coworkers, and I've worked on SETPs before, and there's this subliminal fear of partnership. I find that if we bring all these things to light, we are going to be crucified in a way. And it's, when we go out on audits, we found people to be very nervous when we're writing down things. They're like, oh, we'll fix that. We can move it right now. And I'm like, well, no, you don't have to fix it right now. Like, we are going to give you a report. We're going to tell you, we're going to guide you through this and really give you the tools you need. And once they have that, they kind of, their stress levels go down. So I'm wondering if you've experienced that same kind of fear when people are afraid to reach out to a lawyer, or they're afraid to reach out to the DLC or any kind of resource that you found for voting.
Actually, sorry, before our panel answers that, Jay, I just want to jump in and ask you one quick follow-up.
Sure.
Has your status as a non-binary person, has that ever affected you voting?
You know, I actually did not change. Massachusetts does allow you to write your license to have non-binary. I actually kept it female because I'm afraid that if God forbid I get in an accident and someone needs to look at my ID card, I pass as a woman. And it's a very strange dichotomy, because you can be acknowledged as a woman and someone perceives you as such, and you're safer. I think I experience way less discrimination based on how people perceive me. But then again, they don't acknowledge my true gender identity as a result of that. So it's very strange. And this is also very new for me. I felt this way since kindergarten, but I only came out about a year and a half ago. So it's all very new, and I haven't experienced any, like, this was the first year I voted as non-binary, but I voted by mail. And my information and demographic information still says female. So as I eventually am gathering up the nerve to change my name and change my sex on my ID and everything, but it's, I have to be very careful, because there's a lot of, there's horror stories where EMTs refuse to help trans people when they see that their genitalia doesn't match what they're seeing on their face or on their ID. So there is that fear.
Wow.
I need to do a whole separate session on all of that.
I know.
All the civil rights implications there. I feel like we could talk about that forever. I think I was, oh shoot, and I had a point.
I'm sorry.
I lost it. I got so engaged. The fear of being sued. That's real. And elections officials do get crucified in the press frequently. They do get sued. And now, as of 2020, they have armed people protesting outside the count sometimes. So I don't think their fears are unfounded. That does really happen to them. What's unfortunate is that we often, I can't even say we, NDRN is a national membership association. So really the real work is done by our organizations in the states. Disability Law Center is our organization in Massachusetts, but they go in and talk to elections officials and are like, we want to help you make this better. And sometimes they're so afraid of getting sued, and they think we're trying to trick them so we can get some lawyers in the door, that they won't work with us. And that can be really detrimental. We don't want to have to sue for these things. Lawsuits are costly and time consuming. And a lot of times, actually what happened in Massachusetts, it came down so quickly, which was amazing, because sometimes those suits don't get settled until after an election. So you can go through several election days where people were disenfranchised because we haven't resolved this issue yet. It's so much easier if people will work with us up front and we can fix problems before election day. What we want is for people to be able to vote. Like, if we can achieve that without having to litigate, I feel like that's the first preference, because it just works better for the voters. But it's real. They get sued a lot, and they get really, really crucified in the press. So they're just sometimes really nervous about letting anyone in on the process. And I hate that happens, because there's so much we could do together.
And I think it's important to have established relationships. And, you know, and it's not just leading up to the election, it's year round. And so taking the approach, like, it's not a gotcha moment. It's actually, we're all working together for the same goal. So
Yeah.
how can we make this happen? And having those open lines of communication. And when you are at a site where there actually is an issue, it's how the approach that you choose to take. It's like, oh, you know, I noticed X. Have you thought about Y? And then you can have that, you know, dialogue. Some of them immediately want to jump up and fix it. Like the auto mark machine is not private, right? And so you walk with them and you talk to them about, here is the reasoning behind why it makes more sense. So maybe if we move it this way or that way. And one particular issue, location, they were like, yeah, we'll get to it. Thank you very much. And then I went out to the parking lot and it was all windows into the location. And I looked in and immediately they're conferring. And then I saw them walk over and they started adjusting everything. But so I think approach is part of it. But if you come in with that gotcha and in defense mode, then I think it makes it harder to forge those working relationships.
And I think nationally, that's a thing. And when I go to national conferences and the first thing that they announce, there are no press in the room. These are all friends. You are all in the same boat, and you can just see everybody's shoulders drop. And I think a lot of it has to do with they're wearing 12 different hats, right? And they are constantly being asked to do more with less. And with HAVA being the last distributed this year, and even those arguments about who got what money, how it was spent between the state and the jurisdictions. And when you talk to them, they do it every day. But for some of us, we only pay attention 4 times, every 4 years, maybe every 2. And I think that they're constantly have their armor up because they don't know if you're friend or foe. And when we start talking about even police presence, right? What made Maricopa County so feel safe in counting their ballots was that they were counting the ballots right next to the police station. So when we start talking about, perception and reality and the media and how it's covered and what that means, there's a lot. I mean, there was whole conversations and conferences that got totally usurped, where the conversation was, how do I get a packet of how do I talk about what I do? Because these people are elected. These people are also appointed. These people have been doing it for years. And now because of the pressure, we're concerned that they're all going to retire or no longer want to be in this position because of the amount of pressure, regardless of if we revere them and say that it was the most successful election ever. So I think that when we talk about it, ultimately voting is a human experience. It's human in every single dimension. And for an engineer to say that, I'm just putting that out there, y'all. All right. But I think that that's where we have to start having these conversations. And I really, really hope we continue to have these conversations. And you know what, Michelle and Jay, we want to have these conversations. You want to continue talking about what this means? Let's go for it. Let's keep going. I think that if we just let it stop, because, all right, you know what, 2021, we're going to talk about vaccinations. We're going to talk about a new political party in a particular position of power. What does it mean? And then we just continue moving on. Then, when 2022 happens, we'll start talking about it again, which for a lot of election officials is a little too late.
Yeah, well, we definitely do not know what elections are going to look like next year or in 2 years. I mean, I think that's the one thing that we can all agree on. But I think that's a good sort of hopeful note to end on. I think the past election has sort of made heroes out of these local elections officials, and so maybe that's the hopeful thing to take away, is that despite sort of the complexity and the sort of unnecessary inefficiency of our system, these things do still hold up. And I think as architects, as designers, as stakeholders, we all have a really big role to play in maintaining advocacy. So with that, I was going to just thank the panel one more time. Again, it was Michelle Bishop from the National Disability Rights Network, Marlene Sallow from the Disability Law Center, Gretchen Macht from University of Rhode Island, and Katie Dennis from KMA Architecture and Accessibility. Remember, this program has been recorded, and so it will, hopefully after a few days, be up on our committee page, the Access Committee page at the BSA website, which is architects.org. So look for it there, and you can listen to it again and again at your leisure over the holidays. But I just want to say thanks again to the panel. Thanks very much to the audience. This has been a great discussion, and I'm really excited about moving forward. Great. Bye-bye.